People ask me why I keep the beacon fragment on my desk. It sits in a plain acrylic case, no bigger than a man's fist. A lump of pitted gray ceramic that looks like it came off a road somewhere between nowhere and the back of beyond. Most visitors assume it's a meteorite or a piece of ablative platings from some obsolete hull, and I let them think that my grandchildren pick it up sometimes. It's lighter than it looks, and I watch their faces for the moment they feel the surface and notice the calfront. Regularity of the microchannels scored into it, too precise for erosion, too subtle for any manufacturing process they've been taught to recognize. They always look up at me when they feel it. I always say, set it down gently. Then I tell them I'll explain when they're older. I've been saying that for 11 years. My youngest granddaughter turned 19 last spring. I suppose I owe her the story. My name is Hara Salan. I spent 31 years as a senior sensor specialist aboard various hulls in the 3rd Patrol Arm, and for the last 12 of those years I served aboard the frigate Ardeval. I retired in the rank of Chief Warrant Officer 2nd grade, with a conduct record so clean it embarrassed me at the ceremony. I have 3 commendations and 1 classified notation in my file that I cannot discuss in detail, except to say that it concerns an event that occurred on the 22nd day of the Ardeval's final patrol circuit before her own decommissioning. An event that I have been cleared to speak about in general terms since the Joint Council's Public Disclosure Session 4 years ago, though cleared is perhaps the wrong word for something that still sits in my chest like a stone I swallowed and never quite passed. I am going to tell you what happened on the Ardeval. I am going to tell it plainly. Out the language the Council's Communications Office settled on, which I found to be technically accurate and emotionally inert in the way that all official language is when it is trying to avoid conveying the actual texture of a thing. I am going to tell it the way a sensor specialist tells a story, starting from what I could actually measure and working outward from there. Was a patrol frigate, Tannhäuser class, 31 years old at the time of her final circuit and showing every one of them. She had a crew of 212, a sensor suite that had been partially upgraded twice and was now a patchwork of generations. Some components newer than the ship, some so old the calibration manuals for them no longer existed in the fleet's active database. She was not a prestigious posting. She was the kind of ship that assigned long circuits through what the charts called monitored transit zones. Everyone aboard called the Long Quiet. A band of deep space, roughly 400 light minutes across, skirting the outer edge of what we then called the contact boundary, the theoretical line beyond which no surveyed civilization had yet been confirmed to exist. I say confirmed because, as I would learn, the absence of confirmation is not the same thing as absence. The circuit was 82 days. I had done 11 of them on the Ardeval. Before that, 3 circuits on the Cantor, 2 on the Hessel, on the Old Merrick before she was refit and reassigned. 17 circuits total in monitored transit zone work, which is more than most. Senior crew on ships with the Long Quiet posting tended to be people who had, for one reason or another, developed a tolerance for it. For the particular quality of silence in deep space far from any sun, for the work of making precise records of things that turned out to be nothing, for the rhythms of a ship that was not going anywhere interesting and knew it. I was, by my own assessment and the assessment of my successive commanding officers, very good at this kind of work. I am not a person of dramatic temperament. I do not need stimulation to maintain focus. What I need is a problem with parameters and enough equipment to measure it accurately. I will sit with that problem for as long as the work requires. 12 years on the Ardeval suited me. The Ardeval suited me. The pattern of the circuit was always the same. Transit a scheduled bearing, hold station for passive sweep, log anomalies, resume transit the next bearing. We covered roughly 400,000 cubic light minutes of the Long Quiet on each circuit and into 47 scheduled sweep stations. The anomaly log, in 11 circuits, had contained 8 entries I found worth flagging to the watch officer. 6 of those were instrument artifacts. 1 was a natural formation, an oddly dense microasteroid cluster that had migrated into our transit zone from a nearby system, unremarkable except for its position. 1 was a piece of human-made debris, an old survey relay of a type no longer in production, transmitting a carrier signal on a dead channel, which I flagged more out of professional interest than concern. Fleet Command logged it, and a recovery team collected it 18 months later. Nothing remarkable about it. 11 circuits, 8 anomalies. None of them anything but what they appeared to be. I tell you this so that you understand the baseline I was working from on the 63rd day of final circuit. A baseline of professional patience, of careful observation, of data that had been for more than a decade aboard this ship alone, exactly as boring as it was supposed to be. On the 63rd day, my console flagged a return from a coordinate that my charts marked as a decommissioned survey relay. A Type 7 autonomous beacon placed 90 years prior, flagged as non-operational in our database since a maintenance survey 63 years ago. The return was exactly right for a Type 7 beacon. Size, mass signature, albedo, thermal output, all within normal parameters for a dormant unit of that age. Nothing about it was alarming. Nothing about it suggested I should do anything other than log it as a known derelict and move on. What stopped me was the thermal output. Dormant Type 7 should read at roughly background plus 2 degrees. Maximum. The beacon was reading background plus 2 degrees. But that's not the whole picture. What I was seeing, and I had to run the comparison 3 times before I trusted it, was that the thermal output was not static. It was cycling. The variance was so slight that it would have been invisible against any noisier background, but out here in the long quiet, with the nearest stellar body a quarter light year away, and the background as clean as space gets, I could see it. Repeating oscillation in the thermal signature, rise and fall of 0.803 degrees on a period of approximately 47 seconds. 47 seconds is not a natural number. Stellar processes don't work in periods of 47 seconds. Radioactive decay curves don't produce that pattern. Mechanical resonance in a drifting hulk doesn't either. 47 seconds is a manufactured number. It's a number that comes from something designed to operate on a 47-second cycle. I sat with that for a long time. I ran diagnostics on my own array. I queried the archive on Type 7 thermal decay patterns. I called up the full specification history of the Type 7 program. Every beacon type, every known failure mode, every documented drift behavior in long dormant units. None of the failure modes produced a stable repeating oscillation. Thermal decay in decommissioned units was monotonic. They cooled steadily. They didn't pulse. Mechanical resonance in a drifting object would produce a frequency that decayed as the object tumbled and shed angular momentum. This oscillation showed no decay, 63 years of dormancy, and it was still cycling with the regularity of a clock. I considered the possibility that I was experiencing instrument error. I ran a self-diagnostic on the thermal array and got clean returns. I ran it a second time with a different calibration standard. Still clean. Considered confirmation bias. I had been looking at clean data for 11 circuits, and maybe I was inventing pattern in noise because my brain needed something to do. I tabulated the raw readings and calculated the variance. The oscillation was 14 sigma above background noise. That is not confirmation bias. That is a signal. I considered the particular madness that comes from 63 days in the long quiet is a real phenomenon that patrol specialists talk about openly among themselves and never in front of officers. Long transit work does something to your perception of probability. You start finding shapes and reflections, patterns in static, rhythms in random numbers. The long quiet can make a careful person credulous. I had felt it before, a mild version, susceptibility, and I knew what it felt like. This was not that. Then I woke Lieutenant Commander Eris Favre, the watch officer, and showed her my readings. She looked at them for a long time too. Log it as a contact anomaly, she said. I'll wake the captain. Commander Petra Vance came to the sensor bay in her off-duty clothes, hair unbraided, carrying a cup of something hot that steamed in the recycled air. She was a compact woman, former deep survey background before she transitioned to patrol command, is an unusual career path. Most deep survey officers wanted nothing to do with the methodical quietness of patrol work after years of the genuinely frontier assignments. I had asked her once why she'd made the move. She said she'd found what she was looking for out there and wanted to spend the rest of her career looking for it again. At the time I took that as a private joke about the nature of survey work. Later I revised my interpretation. She looked at my display for about 90 seconds without speaking. She had a way of going very still when she was thinking, not tense, just economical, as if she was rationing motion. And I had learned over 4 years that the stillness meant she had already decided something and was now working out how to explain it to the rest of us. "How close are we?" she asked. 12,000 kilometers, I said. "We came to this bearing on routine transit. We're not approaching it." "Good." She set her cup down on my console's edge, which was against about 4 different regulations, and looked at the screen again. "Options. Could close to 5,000 and run an active sweep," I said. "Better resolution. We'd know more about what's generating the signature. And we'd be generating a much larger electronic signature ourselves," Favre said. "Active array at 5,000 is visible to anyone in this sector, with working sensors." "Yes," I said. "What's the current state of the contact boundary in this region?" Commander Vance asked. I pulled the chart overlay. Uncontact space nominally begins at 212 light minutes from our current position, I said. "We are inside the monitored transit zone, not at the boundary, which means whatever we're looking at is also inside the monitored transit zone," she said, "in human survey space." Officially, I said. She picked up her cup. "We hold position. Passive only. How long before the circuit schedule requires us to move on?" "Nominally 14 hours, I said. "We have some flexibility built into the circuit. We could hold for 18 without requiring a schedule amendment." "Then we watch it for 14 hours, she said, "and we see if it does anything besides breathe." That is the word she used. Breathes. I've thought about it many times since. It was an odd word choice for a trained fleet officer talking about a dormant beacon, and I think now that she already understood something she wasn't ready to say aloud. That the thermal cycling had the quality of respiration, that it was the signature not of a machine running through a program sequence, but something so alive, running at a very low idle, something that had been running at a very low idle for a very long time. We watched it for 14 hours. Shh. I should describe what those 14 hours were like on the Ardeval, because I think people who hear the summary of the contact event have an image of a ship on high alert, crew at stations, weapons warmed, the tension of an imminent threat running through every corridor. That was not what it was like. It was profoundly quiet. Commander Vance ordered no changes to normal watch rotation. She did not call general quarters. She did not warm the weapons. She ordered additional passive sensor resources allocated to my console, and she stationed Favre in the sensor bay for direct oversight. And she went back to her own cabin for 4 hours and slept, which I found both the admirable and faintly disturbing. The rest of the ship went about its business. Meals were served in the wardroom. The engineering team completed a scheduled maintenance cycle on the secondary drive coupling. A complaint was filed over the allocation of recreation time in the forward lounge and resolved by the executive officer. 47 seconds. 7 seconds. The beacon breathed in the dark at 12,000 kilometers, and nobody aboard the Ardeval knew about it except 5 of us. In the 5th hour, the cycle period changed, not by much. It went from 47 seconds to 44 seconds, a shift of 3 seconds that I caught because I had been logging every cycle individually rather than tracking the average. The average would have shown a slight trend over the full 5 hours. The individual logs showed a clean step change at a specific cycle boundary, precise as a switch thrown. Favre looked at my notation. "Could be thermal drift," she said. "The object warming slightly from our own emissions at this range." "Thermal drift moves the period monotonically," I said. "Gradual, continuous. This is a step change. 3 seconds, clean, on a single cycle boundary. The cycles before and after the change are internally consistent. There's no drift within either period. Only the transition point changed." She didn't say anything for a moment then. "Note it in the log. In the 8th hour, the period changed again. 44 to 41, another step change, another 3 seconds, on another clean boundary. In the 10th hour, 41 to 38. In the 12th hour, 38 to 35. I called Commander Vance back to the sensor bay after the 12th hour change. I showed her the log with the 4 data points. 47, 4, 41, 38, 35. The sequence was unmistakable. A countdown in increments of 3, spaced by approximately 2 hours of fixed period, executing step changes with a precision that no naturally degrading mechanical system could maintain. It was counting down. "What's the terminal value?" Commander Vance asked. "If the pattern holds," I said. "The next change would bring it to 32 seconds, then 29, then 26. If it continues decrementing by 3 across equal time intervals, it reaches a single second roughly 8 hours from now. At that point, the thermal oscillation would be below the resolution of my arrays, effectively ceasing. She was still for a long time. Reaches some other terminal action at some other value." "Yes," I said. "That's also possible." She straightened up and looked at the blank wall of the sensor bay for a moment. Then she said, "It knows we're here. I want to be careful about what I say next, because I have told this story several times in the years since the Joint Council's disclosure, and each time I have to resist the urge to make it dramatic in the wrong way. To make the knowing feel sudden, like a door opening. It didn't feel like that. It felt like the opposite. Like a door you'd always assumed was a wall turning out to have been a door all along. And the question wasn't when it opened, but how long it had been there. The beacon had been placed by human survey teams 90 years ago. It had been listed as non-operational for 63 years. But the Ardeval's passive records, which I began to review during that 13th hour, while Commander Vance drafted a contact protocol advisory to fleet, showed something I had not caught before, because I had not known to look for it. The thermal oscillation had been present, at the same baseline amplitude, on every single previous patrol transit through this coordinate. I went back through 8 years of the Ardeval's own archived sensor logs. The oscillation was there in every pass. A stancing 7-second pulse, consistent and stable. In a derelict we had been sweeping past 11 times without noting it, because nobody had held station long enough to distinguish the oscillation from background noise. We had been moving too fast. The signal was only visible if you stopped. I cross-referenced with logs from the 2 other patrol frigates assigned to this circuit. The oscillation was there in their records too. The same 47-second period, the same amplitude, perfectly stable across every transit going back as far as their archived data reached. I pulled the historical archive, going back 31 years, the operational limit of our database, and found the oscillation present in every single pass by every ship. 31 years of documented patrol traffic through this coordinate. 31 years of ships sweeping past a known derelict at transit speed, logging it as inert, moving on, and for every one of those years at every one of those passes, beacon had been sitting there cycling at 47 seconds, until the Ardeval held station. Until we stopped and watched. The countdown had started within an hour of our deceleration. Not when we swept the coordinate on approach. We had swept it at transit speed, the same way every other ship had. The change happened after we had been at rest, actively directing our arrays at it, long enough that whatever was inside had registered the difference between a passing sweep and a watching station. It knew the difference. Tell. I have had 11 years to consider what that implies. I have considered it from several directions, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion. The thing in the beacon had been waiting for a ship to stop and look, specifically, for as long as the beacon had been functioning. Every ship that passed had been noted and catalogued and found to be still moving. The Ardeval, first time in 31 years of logged history, did not move, and the thing inside began counting down. We held position. We watched. The countdown continued. 35, 32, 29, 26. Each step change arriving on schedule, each period internally consistent, each transition clean and precise. It was the most methodical thing I had ever watched. It had the quality of a protocol, a sequence established in advance and executed without deviation. We were not being threatened. We were being processed. Commander Vance drafted her contact advisory to Fleet during the 13th hour. I know from the later disclosures that Fleet Command received it, parsed it as a genuine contact anomaly, and dispatched a response team that would not arrive for 6 days. They were not going to be in time for whatever happened when the countdown reached terminus. The Ardeval was on her own for that part. The countdown reached its terminus at hour 14, almost to the minute of our scheduled departure window. I have wondered whether that was coincidence, and I have concluded that it was not. What happened next I will describe as simply as I can, because the simple description is the true one, because in the years since I have heard it described in ways that add drama where none was needed. The beacon's surface moved. Not explosively. Not with any energy release my sensors could characterize as threatening. Panels. Sections of the outer housing that we had been reading as homogeneous ceramic, separated along seams that had been invisible to every passive scan we'd run, and folded outward with a slowness that suggested either enormous care or enormous age, or possibly both. What was revealed underneath was not machinery in any configuration I recognized. It was not circuitry. It was not any form of power plant or communications array from any human or known alien taxonomy I had studied in 17 circuits of survey work, 12 years of patrol specialization. What it looked like, insofar as it looked like anything, was a collection of structures that had grown into each other over a very long period, branching, intersecting forms, the kind of complexity that biological processes produce over geological timescales when left to develop without external pressure. It was beautiful, I suppose, though I was not thinking about that at the time. I was thinking about the absence of threat signatures, and finding that absence almost more alarming than any weapons lock would have been. A weapon is a thing you have doctrine for. What I was looking at had no doctrine. The Ardeval's proximity alert did not trigger. There was no weapon signature, no drive signature, no energy spike of any kind beyond what I was already recording. What my sensors reported was a marginal increase in electromagnetic activity across broad spectrum, most of it below the frequencies we used for communication, concentrated in ranges we didn't have dedicated receivers for. Then the communications console received a signal. I know what people imagine when I say that. They imagine a voice, or a pattern of pulses that resolved into language after a few tense minutes of code breaking, or something from the library of first contact scenarios that the Fleet's Doctrine Office had spent decades refining. None of that is what happened. The signal was already in a format the Ardeval systems could parse. Not our current protocol, but a legacy format from a comm standard that had been in use fleet-wide approximately 70 years prior, and had been retired as part of a software consolidation program. It was not ancient enough to be completely foreign. It was precisely old enough to require a secondary parsing library to read, one that our systems maintained for legacy compatibility. The signal was in a format that matched precisely the comm standard that the original survey team had been using when they placed the Type 7 beacon 90 years ago. Whatever was inside the beacon had cataloged the protocol from that initial contact, had held it, unchanged, for 90 years. Had used it now because it was the newest format it had available from us, and because using it was itself a message. I have been here since your people first came. I know you from before your protocols changed. I have been watching long enough to know the difference. Communications specialist Davon Recht, who was 26 years old, and on his second patrol, and who handled the moment with a professionalism that I still consider remarkable, reported the incoming signal to Commander Vance in a perfectly level voice, and read the content aloud. It was a short message. Parsed from the legacy format, it said, "We have been here longer than your markers. We know what you are. We know what you are becoming. You may ask one question." The bridge was very quiet for a long time after Recht read that. Commander Vance stood at the center of the bridge. She looked at the display. She looked at Recht. She looked at me. Reasons I have never fully understood. Maybe because I was the one who had found it. Maybe because she wanted a reaction from someone who had been looking at the data longest and had not yet spoken. Her face was composed, not blank. Composed, which is different. The face of someone who has absorbed a bit of information that changes the shape of everything, and is deciding consciously to continue functioning. She asked, "How long?" The reply came back in seconds. It said, "Longer than the oldest thing you think you know." Then it said, "We have watched all of you. Every kind that asks. You are not the first. You are not the last. There are others you do not know, yet who are also watched, who also do not know they are watched. This is the arrangement." Commander Vance read that second message twice. I could see her doing it, her eyes tracking back across the screen. Then she looked at Rect. Send the following. By whose authority? The answer came. Our own. We are old enough that authority is a concept we remember inventing. She turned then, and this is the moment I think about most often, and looked at me. At me specifically. Not at Favre, who was senior. Not at the bridge crew. Not at the executive officer who had arrived on the bridge during the exchange and was standing at the back of the room with the expression of a man trying to process something too large for the available processing space. At me. I don't know why, precisely. I have my theory. I think she looked at me because I was the one who had noticed. I had been the one paying attention closely enough to catch a 0.03 of a degree thermal oscillation in a known derelict at transit range. And to trust what the data said rather than what the chart annotation said, and to hold my ground when Favre suggested thermal drift, and to keep logging individual cycle data rather than aggregate averages. She wanted to know what the person who had been looking at this the longest made of it. She wanted the sensor specialist's assessment before she made the command decision. I said, if it's telling the truth about watching all species that ask, then suppressing this isn't an option. They already know we know. All they think going silent accomplishes is keeping the other monitored species in the dark. She nodded once. She did not ask anyone else. She looked back at Rect. Send this. We will not keep this to ourselves. The others who are also watched, they deserve to know. There was a pause longer than the signal delay warranted. Long enough that I had time to wonder whether we had said the wrong thing. Long enough for Favre to look at me with an expression I interpreted as, please tell me. Your sensors saunts aren't showing anything I should be alarmed about. My sensors were showing nothing. The beacon sat at 12,000 kilometers. Panels open, broadcasting quietly in a spectrum nobody had been listening to. Nothing had changed in the readings. The thing inside was waiting. Then the reply came, we know, we have known, since the first of your kind noticed us. That notification was the only possible outcome. It was always a question of when and whom. We did not choose you. You chose yourselves by stopping then. We will withdraw from this sector. The arrangement continues elsewhere. We do not prevent, we observe. This is what we are. Then, after another pause, longer than any of the previous pauses, long enough that I logged it as a deliberate beat. We are sorry for the weight of what you now carry. You could not have known you were accepting it. You could not have been you and not accepted it. Commander Vimant said nothing for a long time after that last message. The bridge was very still. Could hear the recycling fans, and my own pulse, and someone at the back of the room, breathing through their mouth, she said. Finally, acknowledge. Sent an acknowledgement. The beacon's panels folded closed with the same unhurried care they had opened with. The electromagnetic activity dropped off across the spectrum, gradually, taking about 90 seconds to return to baseline, the way a room returns to quiet after music stops rather than the way a switch turns off. Within 4 minutes, every reading I could take of the beacon was identical to what I had recorded at the start of the watch. A dormant Type 7, background plus 2 degrees, no anomalous signature. The 40-second breathing had stopped. We sat at that coordinate for another 2 hours while Commander Vance drafted her contact report. She did not ask for input. She did not convene a discussion. She wrote it herself with the door to her cabin closed, and she transmitted it herself on the priority channel reserved for first contact events. She came to my station and stood next to me for a moment, looking at my sensor display and the perfectly inert return of the beacon. "Do you want to go get it?" she said. I looked at her. The beacon? Whatever's left of it. There might be something physically in there worth examining. Or there might be nothing. But it's in our patrol zone, and they've withdrawn. And what we have on record right now is a conversation and some sensor logs, and nothing you can put in a case. Is that in the contact protocol? I asked. The contact protocol covers scenarios where the contacted party is still present and capable of objecting. They've withdrawn. She looked at the display. What's in front of us is either a piece of old human survey equipment or a very old piece of something else's survey equipment. Either way, it's floating in our patrol zone and we're authorized to recover derelict hardware. I thought about that for a moment. Yes, I said. I want to go get it. She authorized the EVA. I suited up myself. And I want to be clear that nobody asked me to, nobody expected me to, and I couldn't have fully explained at the time why it felt wrong to send Petty Officer Triss alone. I think it had to do with the fact that I had been watching for 14 hours and felt some obligation to be the one who made contact with, physically, as though the watching created a kind of duty. Triss rode out with me in the utility sled without comment. He was a practical man who did not ask questions he didn't need the answers to. The beacon looked exactly like what the charts said it was: battered cylindrical housing, hull plate gray. The stenciled survey markings of a human fleet program from 90 years ago still legible on one face. The panels that had opened and closed left no visible seam from the outside. The surface looked continuous, undifferentiated. I ran my gloved hand along it and felt the homogeneous ceramic of a standard Type 7 unit. Nothing unusual, nothing at all. But underneath it, in places where the outer skin had been worn thin by decades of micro-impact erosion, there were channels. They appeared in the abraded sections only, where the surface had thinned enough to reveal the substrate beneath, regular, precise, unmistakably deliberate, fine to have been cut by any tool I was aware of. Too consistent to be natural scoring. They ran in patterns I could not parse but could not mistake, the way you cannot mistake a sentence in a language you don't know. You know it is a sentence even without knowing what it says. The patterns had the density of meaning. They had been put there by something with intent. I collected a sample with a cutting tool, a fragment no bigger than my fist, from an area where the surface erosion had already separated a natural edge. The rest of the beacon I documented thoroughly and flagged with a recovery marker, because I had the strong, unreasonable, completely unevidenced sense that removing the whole thing would be the wrong kind of taking. We had taken the conversation. We would take the fragment. The rest I would leave. Triss collected the sample case without comment, and we rode back to the ship. Fleet Command's response to Commander Vance's contact report arrived 6 hours later. The priority traffic I was not supposed to see, and did not see, in its entirety, but I was present when she shared the summary with senior staff in the briefing room. Fleet Command was not displeased with the Ardeval's handling of the contact. What they were concerned with. What had apparently generated a significant secondary traffic volume between commands in the hours since our report was the statement that the ancient observers had been watching not only humanity, but all species that ask, and that they had known, since the first human to notice them, that disclosure was inevitable. If that was true, then the question was not whether to tell the other monitored species. They would find out eventually regardless. The question was how, and in what order, and who should deliver the information. Those were not questions the Ardeval's crew was equipped to answer. Those were questions for the Council. Commander Vance spent the remaining 19 days of the Ardeval circuit in communications with Fleet Command. I was not part of those discussions. What I was part of was the daily work of a patrol ship doing its job, sweeping, logging, transiting, running the long quiet that was now, in my mind, permanently different in character. I had spent 11 circuit looking out at this emptiness and thinking of it as inert. I now looked at it and thought of it as watched. Not menaced, the distinction matters, not endangered. Just observed from a depth of time I couldn't begin to calculate. By something patient enough to have waited 30 years of patrol traffic for a sensor operator to stop and hold station. That thought has never left me. I don't think it's supposed to. There is a particular quality to the realization that you have been seen. Not discovered, seen. Watching and seeing are different things. A thing that watches you catalogs your behavior. A thing that sees you recognizes what you are. The ancient observer's final message had the quality of recognition. You could not have been you, and not accepted it. They had known, apparently, what kind of thing a human was well enough to know what choice a human would make when given the chance to share the information. They were not surprised by Commander Vance's decision. They had been waiting for it. They had built the countdown to accommodate it. I thought about that for the remaining 19 days, in the long quiet that was no longer quiet in the same way. And then I retired, and I came home, and I put the fragment on my desk. The Ardeval was decommissioned 9 months after that circuit. Commander Vance was seconded to the Joint Council's nascent contact coordination, office, where she spent the next 8 years helping to manage the disclosure process, notifying, one by one, the 11 other spacefaring species, subsequently identified as having also been under observation, and managing the various reactions that followed. I read the disclosed summaries of those reactions. None of them surprised me, and all of them were understandable. Knowledge of that kind changes the shape of things. Some species took it quietly, some did not. None of them were destroyed by it. The ancient observers kept their word. They withdrew from our sector, and from the sectors of every monitored species, within 6 months of the joint Council's cascade disclosure. Their signatures have not been detected in any surveyed region of human or allied space in the 4 years since the public disclosure session. Whether they are still operating in the space beyond our survey boundary is a question under active investigation by several institutions. I do not expect an answer in my lifetime, and I think that is probably appropriate. My granddaughter Mira, the 19-year-old, the youngest, the one who inherited my tendency to sit quietly with problems until they open, came to visit last month. She picked up the fragment the way she always does, felt the channels with her thumb, and looked at me. "Grandma," she said, "you keep saying you'll tell us when we're older." "I know," I said. "I'm older," she said. I looked at her. She had the same focused expression she'd had at 5 years old when she decided to learn to read star charts, and simply sat at my desk until I said, "All right, sit down," and I told her. She asked, when I'd finished, the same question everyone asks. "What do you think they are?" Been asked that question many times. I have never found a fully satisfying answer to it, because what I actually think they are is so simple that people expect me to say something more, and I disappoint them. But the simple answer is the honest one. I think they are what happens when a civilization lives long enough to stop wanting anything it doesn't already have. Long enough to let wanting cool into something else. Something more like the patient interest of someone who watches the world not because they intend to act, but because the world is genuinely interesting, and they have had time enough to appreciate it properly. I think they reached a point where knowing became its own sufficiency, where the accumulation of what was seen became more valuable to them than any action the seeing might have justified. And I think they built a machinery of watching, tuned it carefully, and then went very quiet and let it run, for spans of time that make our entire recorded history look like a single watch rotation, on a single patrol frigate in a single transit zone. I think they watched us because watching is what they are now, not what they do, what they are. The second question Mira asked was the one I hadn't been asked before, because nobody else had thought to ask it, or had been willing to ask the obvious follow-up. She said, "Do you think they were sad when you made them leave?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at the fragment in its case. The final message had said, "We are sorry for the weight of what you now carry. You could not have known you were accepting it. You could not have been you and not accepted it." A thing that is only an observer does not say it is sorry for the weight it has transferred, unless it understands what weight feels like. A thing that has been watching long enough to let wanting cool does not forget what wanting was like, any more than an old sailor forgets what it felt like to be afraid of the sea the first time. You can graduate past a feeling and still carry its shape. You can know something is necessary and still mourn what the necessity ends. I think they were sad. I think they understood exactly what the disclosure meant, not just the logistical cascade of 11 species learning they had been watched, not just the retirement of an arrangement that had served them well for time spans we still struggle to bound, but the loneliness of the withdrawal itself. They had been watching all of us, every kind that asks, for longer than we could measure. They had watched humanity light its first fires and lose its first wars and reach for its first stars. They had watched 11 other species do the same, each in their own way, across timescales staggered by millions of years. And then one sensor operator on a patrol frigate held station instead of logging and moving on. And the watching was over, and they had to withdraw and begin again somewhere else. I think they knew it would happen. I think they planned for it. I think the countdown was not just a notification protocol, but a kind of farewell. A careful, structured way of saying, "Here we are. Here is what we have seen. Here is what we leave you with. We do not depart without saying so." Mira sat with that for a while. Then she asked, "Did you name it? The thing in the beacon?" "Not officially," I said. "That's the Joint Council's job. Officially they're called the Prior Observers. Some academic communities call them the Vigil. What do you call them?" I thought about it. "The Watchers," I said, which is not original, but it's accurate. She nodded slowly. She looked at the fragment again. "I think they knew you'd keep a peace," she said. I looked at the fragment too, at the channels catching the afternoon light going gold as they always did at this hour. "I think so too," I said. The door closed. I sat in the afternoon light and let the channels go gold, and thought about a thing that had been watching us for longer than our oldest stones, that had built its patient machinery into the bodies of our own derelict survey equipment, and breathed in a cycle of 47 seconds for 30 years of passing patrols, and that had always known, that one day a ship would stop. They had known what we are. They had planned for what we would do. And they had been right. The weight Commander Vance carried out of that contact exchange, the weight every monitored species now carries who has been told that the long dark was not empty, but attentive. That weight is real. I don't diminish it. Knowledge changes things. It changes the shape of the night sky. It changes the feeling of looking out at the long quiet and seeing not emptiness but depth. It changes what it means to be the first of your kind, to notice, to stop, to look. But I think it is also, underneath the heaviness of it, a strange and irreducible form of recognition. Something looked at us for longer than we have words for and found us worth watching, not to use, to test, not to judge and sentence or absorb or compete with, just to watch, the way you watch something that interests you, that continues to surprise you, that you have not yet stopped finding worth your attention across geological time. There are worse things to be. Lock the acrylic case each night before I sleep. Not because it needs locking, because some things deserve to be handled with care, even when they're just a piece of ceramic with channels in it. Even when whatever made those channels is long gone into some other quiet sector of the vast dark, watching something else that has not yet learned to stop and look. The Ardeval made sure that first contact happened once, and fully, for all of us, not just for humanity but for every kind under that patient gaze. Because that is what you do when you are carrying information that belongs to more than just yourself. You carry it to the people who need to have it. Even knowing the weight of it does not diminish. When you share it, it just becomes a weight that more shoulders bear. I was the one who stopped. I was the one who looked. The Ardeval carried what I found to everyone who needed to know. That is the weight. And if you hold it long enough, and let the afternoon light catch it right, there is something inside it that is not quite peace and not quite pride, but something's made of both. The durable, earned, quietly irreversible thing that comes from having done what you were, exactly, the kind of person to do. I have not described the Ardeval's crew adequately, and I think that is a gap worth closing. Because the people aboard a ship are not scenery. They are the reason the work means something. Commander Vance I have described. Favre I have described partially. Wrecked I mentioned. Let me tell you about a few of the others. Because the contact event did not happen to a ship, it happened to 212 people who were, at the moment of it, going about their lives in the ordinary way. People go about their lives when they are 63 days into an 82-day troll, and they have not found anything unusual in 11 previous circuits. Chief Engineer Sovan Derat had been with the Ardeval longer than any other crew member, including Commander Vance. 19 years on the same hull. He knew her as well as any person knows a ship, which is to say he knew her sounds and her temperatures, and the particular way her port secondary coupling vibrated under load on cold starts. And he knew exactly how long her sensor arrays would run at full passive capacity before the thermal signature started to creep in ways that would affect read quality. During the 14-hour watch I maintained on the beacon, Derat quietly rerouted cooling resources from a non-essential system to the sensor suite without being asked, keeping my array temperatures 3 degrees cooler than standard and extending my effective read resolution by a factor I calculated at roughly 12%. He did this because he had noticed me on watch past the end of my rotation and understood something was happening, and because in 19 years of service he had developed the kind of institutional loyalty that expresses itself not through speeches, but through practical maintenance of the conditions that let other people do their work. He never asked what I had been looking at. When the contact event was later disclosed to the crew, which Commander Vance did in a full company briefing 12 hours after the beacon closed, he sat in the second row and listened with his arms crossed and his expression completely still. Afterward, he came to me in the corridor and said, "Catch." Then he walked away. That was the entirety of his response to the discovery that an ancient intelligence had been observing humanity for longer than recorded civilization, and I found it both inadequate and somehow perfect. The crew as a whole responded in ways that mapped onto their characters. Some became quieter, some became louder. Some sought reassurance in the predictable work of their stations, and some spent hours in the common areas, talking through the implications with, or would listen. A small number became briefly preoccupied with the question of whether we were still being watched right now, at this moment, whether the withdrawal had been genuine, and whether the fact of knowing changed anything about the behavior of the watchers. Commander Vance addressed these concerns in a supplementary briefing 3 days later, with exactly the patient competence she always brought to things she hadn't planned for, and the preoccupation largely resolved into something quieter and more permanent. What I observed in the crew during those final 19 days was something I've tried to put words to several times and never quite succeeded. The closest I've come is this. They were different in the way that adults are different from children, not in any single expressible quality, but in the accumulated weight of knowledge that changes the texture of how you hold yourself in the world. They had been told something that could not be untold. The long quiet had turned out to be not quiet at all, not empty at all. And they were, each in their own way, absorbing what it meant to have been the crew of the ship that found that out. I was proud of them. I still am. I want to return briefly to something I passed over too quickly when I described what the beacon's interior looked like when the panels opened. I said it looked like structures that had grown into each other over a very long period. I said it did not match any human or known alien engineering taxonomy. Both of those things are true, but they don't convey the actual experience of looking at it on my sensor display. And I think the experience matters. Human engineering is organized around problems. We have a function that needs performing. We design a structure to perform it, and the structure is as compact and efficient as we can make it, given available materials and skill. The result is things that look purposeful in a specific way. You can generally identify what a human component is for by looking at it. Known alien engineering follows roughly analogous logic, varying in aesthetic but consistent in the underlying principle that a thing exists to do a job and has been shaped by that job. What I was looking at in the beacon did not have that quality. The structures inside were intricate, vastly, almost incomprehensibly intricate, given how small the beacon housing was. But their intricacy did not feel purposeful in the way I was trained to recognize. It felt more like the intricacy of something that had been developing for a very long time in stable conditions, adding to itself incrementally, the way mineral formations add layers over millennia. It felt like growth rather than construction. I sat with that impression for a long time during the contact event, and I have sat with it many times since. Conclusion I have arrived at, and I am a sensor specialist, not a theorist, so take it for what it is that the thing in the beacon had not been built the way we build things. It had been started, and then given time, and what you got when you opened the housing after 90 years was the accumulated result of that time. The entity that had designed the starting condition had been confident enough in what time would produce to not need to control the intervening process. That implies a degree of patience and a depth of understanding of developmental processes that I find, when I let myself think about it at length, genuinely staggering. They had known, 90 years ago, what the thing in the housing would look like now, the way a skilled forester knows what a planted tree will look like in a century. They had engineered an outcome without controlling the path to it. I think about that in the context of their final message. We are sorry for the weight of what you now carry. The weight they were sorry about was not the fact of their existence or the fact of the watching. The weight was the cascade, the disclosure, The 11 species, the changed shape of the known galaxy, the permanent alteration of how every monitored civilization understood its own history. They had known it was coming. They had been patient enough to wait for it, and sad enough about its arrival to say so. A thing that is sorry is a thing that has something it values losing. They had valued what they were doing. The watching was not a burden to them. It was in some sense that I can approximate but not fully articulate what they lived for. And then we stopped and looked, and they had to go. My granddaughter Mira will be 20 in 2 months. She called me last week to say she has up for a placement in the fleet's new deep observation program. A formation that exists, in part because of the Ardeval's contact report and the subsequent Joint Council recommendations about the value of stationary long-range passive sensing rather than transit speed sweeps. Programmed ships will not move through their assigned zones. They will hold station. They will watch. I did not tell her to pursue it or avoid it. It is her decision, and she has the instincts for it. She knows how to be still, and how to wait, and how to maintain the quality of attention over long periods without expectation. She gets that from somewhere, I told her. If you go, look carefully at everything the chart says is inert. Look especially carefully at the things that have been inert for a long time. Look at them the way you look at old things. Not with the assumption of emptiness, but with the respect for what patience and time can produce. She said she understood. I think she does. The fragment catches the light differently at different hours. In the morning, when the sun comes in from the east, the channels score the surface in long parallel shadows, fine as hair. At noon, they nearly vanish into the gray. In the late afternoon, they go gold, and for a few minutes they look almost like writing, like something inscribed by something with a great deal of time and a great deal of patience and a great deal that it wanted to say and chose, instead, to leave in a place where someone who stopped and looked carefully enough might someday find it. The channels are not writing. I had the fragment analyzed by 3 separate institutions in the years after the disclosure, and none of them were able to extract semantic content from the patterns. Whatever information they carry, if they carry information at all, is not accessible by any method currently available to us. We know they are deliberate. We know they have structure. We cannot read them. I find that appropriate. The watchers were patient enough to wait 30 years for a sensor operator to stop. Whatever they inscribed in the material of the beacon housing, if they inscribed anything, presumably aimed at a timeline consistent with the rest of their patience. It is not meant to be read today. It may not be meant to be read in my lifetime, or my granddaughter's lifetime, or the next several generations after that. Or it may never be readable by us at all, because it was put there for someone, or something that came after us in the long sequence that we interrupted by stopping too early, and the Ardeval, by stopping, changed what comes after. I don't know. I keep the fragment anyway. I keep it because I was the one who found it. And because it is all I have that is physically from that moment, and because I am a sensor specialist, and a sensor specialist keeps good records, the fragment is a record. It is a record of a specific thing that happened, to a specific ship, on a specific day. The day a species that had been watching us for longer than we can measure decided, finally, to speak. They chose words carefully. They had a long time to choose them. I have had 11 years to sit with what they chose, and I am still finding the weight of it, and I think I will be finding it for the rest of the time I have. That seems right to me. Some things should stay heavy. Some things should remind you, every time you pick them up, of what it means to stop and look and refuse to pretend that what you found is what the chart says it is. The Ardeval made contact once. She made sure the word got out to everyone who needed it. That is enough. That was always enough.